Good afternoon and welcome to this DG Tax event where we are going to be talking about the mega trends that we are seeing in the world and the way they are impacting taxation. We have seen major changes all across the world in terms of rapidly aging population, the changes that have been brought by the digitalisation of our economy, the green transition, climate change, and also globalisation. All the way in which the world is changing is affecting the way we consume, the way we work, and the way that we do business. And that inevitably has an impact on taxation as well. That will be what we will be discussing today with two panels of high-level speakers, an interview that you will be following in a second, but also with the President of the Commissioner Gentiloni and Commissioner SCHMIT that will be sharing their view on this issue. If you would like to be part of the conversation as well, make sure that you go on social media and use the hashtag Taxation 2050, TaxMix 2050, sorry, and that you share your views, your comments, but also your questions. If you would like to be part of this chat, we're going to have an interactive session in every one of the panels that we're going to have. So if you would have questions for our speakers, please share them via Slido. You're going to see a QR code on your screen. You can use that QR code or you can type slido.com and use the hashtag TaxMix2050 to ask your questions. Before we jump into this conversation, I would like you to hear what the Commissioner for Economy, Paolo Gentiloni, has to say about the subject.
Our world has changed radically in the last decade, and the pace of these changes is certainly not slowing down. Population aging, climate change, globalization, digitalisation, all of these are profoundly altering the way we live and work. Moreover, the pandemic has highlighted the vulnerabilities in our health systems, but also in our social and economic models. These rapid changes and the challenges that go with them are forcing us to reconsider what type of world we want to live in. They are also putting in question the principles on which taxation is based and our ability to raise the necessary revenues to finance the welfare systems that we not only hold dear, but which have helped to see us through the pandemic. It is imperative to, therefore, ask ourselves if our tax systems are prepared to face these challenges. Indeed, European citizens are asking us to do just that. The Conference on the Future of Europe has shown us that citizens are aware, they are engaged, they are determined. They are telling us to move away from labor taxation, to target tax evaders, and to ensure that all multinationals pay their fair share. These citizens are asking the right questions. How can the EU support the ability of member states to finance themselves in a sustainable manner? How can we best ensure that all companies operating in the EU pay their fair share of taxes? What is the best way to take decisions on important tax matters? And, most importantly, how can we make our tax systems fit to support inclusive and sustainable growth? Since 2020, two major external shocks have battered member states' finances. First, the pandemic, and now Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. In response to the pandemic, swift and unparalleled measures were taken by the EU and member states, including in the field of taxation, to support households and businesses. Public expenditure has a percentage of GDP jumped from 46.5% in 2019 to 53% in 2020. And it is projected to remain above pre-pandemic levels in 2022, according to our forecast. As for Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, this is not only taking a devastating toll on the civilian population and infrastructure itself, but it is creating serious challenges for Europe as a whole. Rising energy prices, supply chains disruptions, and much higher inflation. So, today's debate could not be more timely. Tax systems need not only to be aligned with current social, economic, demographic, and environmental realities. We also need to create future-proof tax rules that address the mega trends we are facing. As our population ages, a shrinking workforce will have to sustain a growing number of older people. By 2070, the share of the EU population aged 65 years and over in the total population will increase from 20 to 30%, while the share of working-age population will decline from 59 to 51%. This will put increasing pressure on our pension systems, and it also calls into question the ability of the current tax mix, which relies heavily on labor taxation, to deliver the same revenues that can fund public expenditure more generally. And faced with both the growing climate emergency and Putin's weaponization of energy supplies, we must remain unwavering in our commitment to become more autonomous in terms of energy and less dependent on fossil fuels. Green taxation can contribute to achieving those goals and should be used more extensively. Green taxes currently constitute less than 6% of the overall tax mix across the EU. More concerning, green taxes decreased between 2019 to 2020. At the same time, these taxes need to be well designed to minimize negative impacts on the less well-off in our societies. They also need to be complemented with a broad range of tools, like pricing instruments, subsidies, regulatory standards, and investment in public infrastructure. So we need to find the best mix and right balance of all of these. More flexibility to work and do business remotely brings with it both new opportunities and new challenges. According to Eurostat, in 2019 there were 17.9 million EU citizens moving within the EU, of which 13 million were of working age. The trend is there to stay, and we expect mobility to strengthen in the future. And while this has proven an advantage during the pandemic, it also poses difficult questions for tax systems, notably in terms of applying the principles of residency and source. Digitalisation can also make it easier for those looking to evade or avoid taxes, and it poses new legal challenges, not least how to tax cryptocurrencies and virtual assets. But at the same time, digitalization can be an opportunity for tax administration to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of their work, improving the collection and protection of public revenues and reducing compliance costs for businesses. The context for the EU business taxation has changed radically in recent years. The current international corporate tax system was designed more than a century and is based on outdated principle of tax residence and source. The recent two-pillar agreement of the OECD G20 inclusive framework marks a historic step forward toward addressing various issues in 21st century corporate taxation. However, I believe we can be more ambitious still, and the Commission has initiated a number of proposals, which we outlined in our communication on business taxation for the 21st century. Today's conference is one of several events we are hosting to stimulate discussion on the right tax framework for the future. These will culminate in a high-level tax symposium on November 28 this year on the EU tax mix on the road to 2050. The symposium will help generate ideas on the large-scale tax changes needed across the EU and will fuel our policy priorities for the future. So with that goal in mind, let me thank you for participating today, and I wish you all a stimulating and successful conference.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Indeed, we're back live in Brussels. The picture that the Commissioner painted is very important because what we're going to be talking about today is how we can address all those challenges that have contributed to a debate about how we have to change our taxation system to adapt it to the current world. What the Commission has done is conducting an annual report like they do every year, and they have identified a number of trends that need to be addressed. And this is what we're going to be talking about today with Benjamin Angel, who is the Director for Direct Taxation at DigiTax UT. Thank you so much for being here today with us. Now, one of the issues that the Commissioner mentioned was the pandemic. We have gone through a major health crisis, and that inevitably had an impact as well on the way we consume, on the way we work, because of the many consequences of the pandemic, particularly due to the lockdown. And I was wondering how much the pandemic has affected to tax revenues.
Quite strongly, actually. We have experienced the first significant fall in tax income in decades. The tax income has fallen by around 4%, which is really a lot, but which is normal if you take into account the fact that a large part of the economy has come to a halt, that it was difficult to consume also for consumer, which also has an impact on the VAT income, and that member states have taken many measures to support the economy. Overall, the tax pressure has increased a bit. For the first time, it went over 40%. But this is primarily due to the fact that it's a ratio over the gross domestic product, and the recession has been so big that mechanically, if you have slightly less taxes over a very depressed GDP, the ratio is increasing. This is exactly what has happened. This year, actually, the one we are going through will probably be also an interesting year from a taxation point of view. It's a bit too soon to say what the impact will be. There will certainly be evolution in both directions. On the one hand, inflation is mechanically increasing the output of some taxes. For instance, when prices go up, the VAT that you get also goes up mechanically. In some member states, inflation might also trigger what we call a bracket creep. That is, when the brackets are not indexed, some people will move to a higher bracket just mechanically. So this trend can lead to higher taxes, but we have also an opposite trend, because in some cases, inflation will also impact the profitability of company. In areas where there is a lot of competitive pressure, the companies will not have the possibility to pass through the increase in energy costs that they're facing to the consumer, and they will cut their profitability. And when companies cut their profitability, it means also that what you get from the corporate income tax goes down. So we will know next year what is the impact of the current crisis. It's a bit sad that we're moving from one crisis to another, but that is primarily due to the action of Russia.
Talking about the previous crisis, the pandemic, one of the tools that was used by member states and by the Commission to try to tackle the economic consequences of the pandemic was indeed taxation. What is it that we've done through the pandemic using taxation, and we could have done more?
Well, first it's worth recalling that the European Union has done a lot beyond taxation. We have de facto suspended the Stability and Growth Pact, which gave a lot of leeway for a member state to find the appropriate answer at national level. We have used all the flexibility existing in the stated framework to also let member states support their economy. We have established a very significant instrument to support the economy, notably SURE, which helps to support unemployment benefit, and Next Generation EU, which is an XXL package, €750 billion to help anchoring the recovery. From the tax point of view, we had a collection of domestic measures and EU measures. The domestic measures were primarily tax deferral. In some cases, we had also a temporary VAT reduction. We had a number of other measures aiming at leaving more breathing space to company. At EU level, we also had a few measures, not many, but to be fair, the competencies of the European Union in the tax area are not as developed as the one existing in the level of our member state. So we had, for instance, a measure where we lifted entirely the custom duty and VAT on imports for the products which are needed to fight the pandemic. So all the protective equipment, the tests, for instance, that were needed. And that helped to facilitate the imports of products which at that time were not that much manufactured in the European Union. We have also developed at European level a new approach to support member state where the Commission has centralized purchase on behalf of the member state. The most visible one was for the vaccine, where we have successfully developed a policy which allowed to put all Europeans on an equal footing in their capacity to access high-quality vaccine, which was key in fighting the pandemic. But that was accompanied by a tax measure. So we had a dedicated directive which allowed the Commission to be exempted from VAT when we follow this model, which is called the buy and donate, when we buy to donate to member state. And this has been adopted pretty quickly by member state.
We have talked about we heard the Commissioner about the conference on the future of Europe and how taxation has become one of the major issues that citizens would like to see addressed at the European Union level. And I was wondering, how do you think taxation can contribute to a fair, more sustainable, more equal recovery, considering the impact that we have seen not only in the pandemic but right now of the war? How can taxation can actually be part of the response to the economic shocks that we are seeing?
Taxation is certainly part of the response, and it is an uneasy question. So I would like to make 3 remarks. The first, which is pretty obvious, is that everyone has to pay his fair share, and that calls for making further progress in fighting aggressive tax planning, in fighting tax evasion, in making sure also that member states do not extend sweet deals to the rich to attract them, and creating somehow unfair treatment for the other citizen. The second element that we have to keep in mind as well is that we have to ensure the taxpayer that there is value for money. I think the acceptability of significant level of taxation is much bigger when people have the feeling that the public service that they get in return is of high quality. So there is a constant requirement on public administration to make the necessary effort to make sure that they reach the quality which is expected and that they carry out the structural reforms which are needed to make sure that it is done in a cost-efficient way, since it is entirely financed by the taxpayer. Third remark, the tax mix must be fair. And that is certainly one of the most difficult areas that we have to tackle. We have seen over the last decade the corporate income tax going down. And the share of the corporate income tax today in the resources of member states is very limited. Most people would be surprised, but today the corporate income tax is only 6 to 7% of the resources of member states, so it's really tiny. The bulk, as the Commissioner was saying, is labor taxation. And we know that it is not sustainable because of aging. The other significant source of income for member states is indirect taxation, VAT. But this is coming with other problem from a fairness point of view, which is VAT tends to be regressive. We try to correct it by playing with the rate for certain product, but this correction cannot completely offset it. So having a tax mix which ensures fairness in a context where you had pressure downward for corporate income tax, where labor taxation will go down because of aging, and where VAT is socially unfair, forces us to be more creative and to contemplate future sources of taxation. And that is one of the main elements that we will have to discuss in the tax symposium that will take place in November.
We can talk later about international taxation because you mentioned the issue of minimum corporate tax, but one of the issues that you mentioned as well was indeed a fair taxation, making sure that people pay the fair share, that they do not conduct tax avoidance. And I was wondering, in that sense, what is the Commission doing and how it is contributing to the job that mainly the member states do in terms of making sure that both companies and people pay the fair share, their fair share?
So we're doing a lot, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, we have first developed over the years a number of initiatives which aim at ensuring a very robust exchange of tax information between member states. This is done via the Directive on Administrative Cooperation, the so-called DAC. You know that it is difficult to adopt directive in the tax field because we need unanimity, but there is one exception, the Directive on Administrative Cooperation, because the member states see the interest of having an extensive exchange of information so as to get all the data they need to be able to tax. We have already 7 directives, and we are working on presenting soon the 8th directive, which will cover crypto assets. And each one was extending the net. The 7th one, for instance, was covering the internet platform. Second, we have a set of legislation which aims specifically at fighting tax avoidance and tax evasion, the so-called Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive. We have ATAD 1, ATAD 2. And we are trying to somehow bring the missing stones to our wall. At the moment, we are in legislative discussion on very important initiatives that the Commission presented in December, which aims at fighting shell companies, which are often misused for evading taxes or hiding also dirty practices, which is something that we we'll see also when implementing sanctions against the Russian oligarchs. It's quite difficult because very often the assets are hidden via a cascade of shell companies. This will be addressed once this legislation is adopted, and we have good progress in this field. We are working also on new initiatives. We will have soon information on crypto assets, which will allow us to be able to tax them. We will, for sure, also propose rules related to ensuring transparency on, it's a bit technical, what is called tax ruling on natural persons, which may be unencrypted, is providing transparency on the sweet deals you get to attract some rich people. Today, this is completely untransparent. And we're working also on developing our international action. So that is a domestic action, but we are very active internationally. The EU has taken the initiative in 2017 to launch a listing of non-cooperative tax jurisdictions, the so-called blacklist. We have more or less half of the planet, which is being scrutinized for its tax practices, where we try to encourage them to join the international tax good governance standards. And via this mechanics, we have obtained very significant progress, actually. Thanks to us, the number of countries joining the International Convention for Cooperation in this field has skyrocketed. And we have obtained more than 140 changes of legislation in more than 60 foreign countries. So it shows that when the European Union uses its collective power to try to make progress in fighting tax bad practices internationally, we can get result. We're working on bringing it even further with an initiative which will come probably somewhere at the beginning of next year, which will address specifically the issue related to enablers. That is, all those which contribute by their work to create structures in third countries which are used for tax evasion. Usually, when you see big tax evasion cases with structures being created in Cayman Island or British Virgin Island or any other tax haven you can think of, you have a smart guy behind it, which is not the taxpayer, because usually the taxpayer does not have the expertise to do it. So it's important to have a set of behavioral rules that apply to those that provide advice on creating those structures to make sure that we manage to prevent tax evasion at the root.
Mm-hmm. Before we continue with this chat, I would like to remind our audience that we're taking questions. So if you go to slido.com and you use the hashtag TaxMix2050, you will be able to ask your questions straight away to the director, or you can use the QR code as well to access our Q&A. Now, another side of these changes that we are seeing is obviously climate change. And the Commission has put forward a strategy to try to reduce emissions by 2050 to zero, and that also means major changes in the industry, in the way we do businesses. And I was wondering, how can taxation contribute to that green transition as well?
Well, taxation can have a significant role to play. It helps getting the right price signal. If we don't force the economic agent to do what the economists would call internalize the negative externalities, that is, put in the prices the element which help changing the behavior, we will have difficulties to go where we want to go. We're trying to adjust the existing rules. We have a directive on energy taxation, which is one of the most outdated piece of EU legislation. It contains a level of taxation in absolute amount, which have not been changed or updated since 2003. Since then, we have new sources of energy, and obviously with inflation, so this directive has lost any significance, and we are in the process of refurbishing it, making it smarter, more efficient, so as to be able to guide the evolution. Taxation can also be very important in driving the right behavior, and in that sense, there is certainly a bigger role to be played in the future on energy taxation. As the Commissioner was saying, energy taxation represents today only 6% of the environmental taxation, and the 6% of the resources of the member state, which is very little. And if we want to get there, we have to do it in a way which is socially fair. Because we have seen also in some member states the sensitivity of the topic. And clearly the current evolution of energy prices makes this task even more complicated, at least in the short run, as long as we have those abnormally high price level. Last but not least, it is important also for fighting climate change to be able to put a price tag on carbon consumption. We have it in the European Union via the emission trading schemes. We're trying to do it also internationally by creating a carbon border adjustment mechanism whereby we will be allowed somehow to put a carbon charge on imports equivalent to the one which would have been paid by a domestic producer. And we are trying to incentivize third country to take action so as to introduce themselves some form of carbon pricing. Because whatever a foreign producer does at home is automatically deducted from the charge they would have to pay under the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So if they reduce their carbon footprint, they may have nothing to pay even at the end. If a foreign country introduces a carbon pricing, be it emission trading scheme or a carbon tax, we fully take it into account and we fully deduct it. So that's an indication on how some tools that we're using, and carbon border adjustment mechanism is not a tax, but it's a tool that takes into account taxation of carbon by other countries, can incentivize the use of this kind of tool to make progress in fighting climate change and protecting the environment.
The other major transformation that we are seeing is the digitalisation of our economy. And that has an impact as well in the way we do business, in the way we interact, and obviously as well in the way we work. How can taxation not only change because of digitalisation, but also contribute to that accelerating process that we are seeing?
For taxation, I would say that digitalization is both a challenge and a blessing. A challenge first because it brings new complex issues to solve. The first one is, how do we tax the digital sector? Traditionally, taxation is based on physical presence. So you produce a good in my country, I tax you. The specificity of the digital sector is that from anywhere in the world, you can serve the whole planet virtually and make a lot of money in some country without paying a single cent. That is what we try to address via the OECD discussion on Pillar 1, among other things. But it is only one of the challenges raised by the digital sector. The Commissioner mentioned an important other one. How do we tax crypto assets? It's very difficult, and if you look at the situation today in our member state, it is sharply different from one member state to another, which certainly calls for more discussion at European level on what is it that we should do. How do you tax also new forms of creating value? For instance, when you do a research on Google, it's free. You don't pay anything. But actually, you don't pay anything because the product is you. Google is making money out of your data. That we need also to take it into account when taxing. So we have a collection of challenges, but digitization is also a blessing for the tax administration because it brings tools that we didn't have before. We have some countries which have made spectacular progress in fighting tax evasion, notably in the field of VAT, by using smart tools. Big data, artificial intelligence, that allows to detect automatically the area which are going wrong and to target the tax audit. And when I say spectacular result, it's really spectacular result. We have seen member states reducing the VAT gap, for instance, the proportion of VAT that they should have collected but did not, by nearly 10 percentage points in the space of 2 to 3 years, just by using smarter IT tools. The Commission will make a proposal in the autumn for VAT in the digital age, where we will try to push for real-time invoicing, for a number of elements also which will allow some real-time reporting and analysis. And with those tools, we can make huge progress in making sure that everyone pay the tax it is supposed to pay, no more, no less, but that's the basis of ensuring tax fairness.
Two things that you mentioned in that question that I think are relevant. One of them is the issue of addressing this through an international cooperation, and we have seen the agreement within the OECD. But we are seeing as well that it's hard to then translate into EU law because we are indeed blocked by unanimity. So how do you see this moving forward? And also a little bit wider question, these differences between different member states and the way that they approach taxation, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, how is this a challenge for the European Union moving forward in shaping the new tax system?
Well, it's clear that our life would be much easier without unanimity. That is not exactly a scoop. Unanimity in taxation is somehow one of the few areas remaining in the treaty where we are not under the ordinary legislative procedure. It takes into account the fact that taxation is historically one of the oldest power acquired by Parliament. It started in 13th century in the United Kingdom, and it's extremely difficult to ignore it. We have to take into account also that the differences of preference of member states are significant and reflect also differences in their social models. We have some member states with a very developed and sophisticated welfare state and a very high level of public spending that needs to be financed, and member states with a much less sophisticated welfare state, a relatively low level of public spending, and for which, almost mechanically, the financing needs are very different and much lower. So we are not in a situation where we have a one-size-fits-all in the area of taxation. Now, talking about the ongoing discussion on Pillar 2, that is minimum effective taxation, for which we have a directive under discussion. This is a very important text that aims at ensuring an end of the race to the bottom. So we do need it. We are nearly there. We have 26 member states on board, and all efforts are placed now in making sure that we reach unanimity quickly. There is no shortcut to it. There is no way to circumvent the unanimity requirement in the treaty. It doesn't mean that we cannot adopt text in the tax field. If you look at the precedent legislature, for instance, the number of tax directives which has been adopted was double digit. And we were at EU 28, actually, with another member state which was not well known for its passion for harmonizing taxes, but yet unanimity could be reached. So it takes more time, it takes more effort, but it doesn't mean we can't make it.
You have hope that we're going to be able to have an agreement soon.
Well, Jean Monnet used to say, I'm not optimistic, I am determined.
That's good. I'm going to remind again my audience that we can answer your questions. So if you have any question, please go ahead, type it on slido.com. We're using Tax Mix 2050. Please share your questions with us. And I think we have one indeed. Could you please elaborate on the initiative to fight shell companies' tax abuse? What would be the reaction from member states, for example, Luxembourg?
Well, we are already well advanced in the legislative discussion of this text, since we had 5 full days meeting with member states. We will have the 6th one in 10 days, actually. I think member states are all engaged in a constructive way. Everyone agrees that this is a major difficulty that we face in the tax area. The question refers to Luxembourg, and I guess this reference comes from the fact that OpenLux last year has illustrated that there were indeed a lot of shell companies in Luxembourg. We chose A, the importance of the topic, and B, the fact that shell companies were used not only by companies, but also by individuals. There are, for instance, a lot of people which try to hide assets via shell company to escape wealth taxation. But the intention to Luxembourg does not mean that the situation is necessarily worse in Luxembourg than in other member states. It just happens that Luxembourg has a register of beneficial owners, so who owns those companies, which is much more transparent than the one of other member states and easier to access, which has allowed the consortium of investigative journalists to do a very thorough assessment. So we know that it's a big issue in Luxembourg. We suspect that it's a big issue in many member states. So it is really important that we make progress in this field, and all member states are committed to make such a progress. And I'm confident that we should have an agreement under the Czech presidency, so before the end of the year, in this legislation, which will allow to do us some look-through. That is to do as if the structure was not here and draws a tax consequence. So it will not prohibit shell company, because there can be plenty of reasons, legitimate one, to have dormant structure for groups and companies, but it will make them useless from a tax point of view. And this is exactly what we're trying to achieve.
We'll be following very closely that discussion. I'm going to see if there are any more questions coming from the audience, because otherwise I still have a few of them. While our audience share their questions, one of the ways that the Commission is trying to encourage reforms in member states is through the Resilience and Recovery Fund, which is helping countries to recover from the pandemic. And I was wondering, within those plans, what is the role of taxation, whether this is part of the reforms that the Commission is pursuing, and how is that collaboration with member states in making sure that they put taxation at the core of those reforms as well?
Taxation is indeed one important component of those plans. We have obtained significant progress via the recovery plan in a number of difficult areas. There's one area in particular which we have addressed in the beginning of our conversation, which is the fight against aggressive tax planning. 6 member states have received what we call CSRs, that is country-specific recommendations. So recommendation voted by the Council itself, so by the member state, telling them to address one big issue, which is the lack of withholding tax on outbound payment. And those 6 member states have received this request almost year after year for a number of years. They were not moving within the framework of the European semester. With RRP, we were able to reduce very significantly the number of countries which will have in the future this difficulty. The Netherlands had already legislated. Cyprus has announced that it will introduce such a legislation, and Ireland as well. Malta has launched a survey, so let's see what they do. And Luxembourg has not committed yet, but we would hope that in some not too distant future, Luxembourg will see the light and see the interest of having also withholding tax on outbound payment to avoid a situation where a flow moves within the European Union, is not taxed by the member state, but is not taxed also by the country where it is going. What we call technically double non-taxation means it is never taxed anywhere. That is not sound. Member states need resources to finance their economy, and we need to avoid aggressive tax practices. But the RRP goes beyond aggressive tax planning. It covers actually all areas of relevance for the state. For instance, we have 14 member states which have recommendation on green taxation and how to develop it. And the Commission also, via the envelope, which is pretty big, of Next Generation EU, has tried to incentivize EU tax and custom administration to make use of the possibility of financing for modernizing their equipment, their tool, getting better IT, getting the big data systems that we were talking about, so as to make sure that they're able to fight tax evasion effectively and to get and collect the tax they're supposed to collect.
We're running out of time, but there was one last question that was coming from the audience that I think is very relevant, considering that we have a vote at the European Parliament next week on this issue, and is, would you consider linking the EU taxonomy with a shift from labour to sustainability taxation in the future?
That's a very complex topic and a very difficult one. We know that the discussions of the taxonomy have been very difficult and sensitive for member states. For sure, we have to make progress in some area related to the use of tax tool in fighting climate change and environmental damages. And the taxonomy will be an important source of inspiration when designing those instruments.
Thank you so much, Mr. Angel, for your contribution today. I am sure that our audience is looking forward to have a look at that annual report on taxation. And we keep the conversation going. But before that, I have a video message for you from the Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Commissioner SCHMIT, Nicolas SCHMIT. And just after that, we will have a short coffee break and we will be back with our panel session. So stay tuned. Here, I leave you with Commissioner SCHMIT.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to participate in this event on the interesting question of megatrends and their impact on taxation. It gives us the opportunity to think about how labor markets and work patterns are expected to change over the next 10 to 20 years, and the impact that this will have on our economies and societies. New types of jobs, work patterns and sectors are emerging on an almost daily basis. Look back 20 years and think about how much the labor market has changed in this time. Certainly you wouldn't have been ordering your ride home via an app 20 years ago. The emergence of digital labor platforms has had a huge impact on how consumers engage services and, of course, as a consequence, on the working conditions for people who work for them. Around 40% of employment in the EU does not anymore involve a traditional full-time permanent contract between an employee and an employer. This has an impact on our tax systems as well as on our social protection systems. We certainly have to make sure that the new types of work in the gig economy do not operate outside these systems. Taxes have to be paid as well as social contributions. And at the same time, platform workers should benefit from the same social and labor rights as other workers. This is the aim of our proposal on improving working conditions for people working through platforms. To keep adapting to the latest changes and trends in the world of work, one thing is clear. We need to up our game when it comes to lifelong learning. We are facing a global labor shortage, and it will take a concerted effort to identify the skills gaps and invest heavily in reskilling and upskilling the population. Certainly, a megatrend that will continue to have an impact on the economy is the transition towards climate neutrality. The green transition can provide positive labor market benefits, bringing an estimated 2 million new jobs by 2050. However, it will of course mean that some sectors are diminished, for example, in fossil fuel extractive sectors, while others emerge, again highlighting the urgent need for reskilling campaigns. We should not neglect the distributional impact of this major transformation. Another megatrend is related to demographics. The EU's working age population has been shrinking for a decade and is projected to fall by 18% by 2070. The share of people above the age of 65 will increase significantly in all European countries. This has a huge impact on national pension systems and at the same time means that people are likely to work for longer than their grandparents did. It also means we need to be prepared to support people in long-term care, both the people receiving the care and those providing it. These are just a few examples for you to discuss in the sessions today. What is clear is that as these megatrends take hold, it is essential that we have in place inclusive and fair policy measures that respond to dynamic labor markets. Taxation systems certainly have to adapt to these important changes in order not to impede them, but also to guarantee social justice. Thank you.
Hello and welcome back. We are live in Brussels for the first panel session of this DG Tax Conference, where we are talking about mega trends and how those are affecting to taxation. And for this first panel session, we're going to be talking about aging and the impact on taxation in terms of the way it has affected the labor market. We work for a longer period of time and how that has an impact as well on the social protection system and how to pay for that. And for that, I am very happy to welcome live from Washington, Ruth Demoy, who is Assistant Director at the Fiscal Affairs Department in the International Monetary Fund. We have as well Maria Jepsen, who is Deputy Director at Eurofund, and we have Agnieszka Dominczak, who is Vice Rector for Science and Head of the Institute of Statistics and Democracy at SGH Warsaw School of Economics. Thank you so much for being here today with us. I would like to start by asking Ruud, why is becoming aging such an issue in terms of public finance, and how is the situation different in different countries? We can't hear Ruud, I am afraid.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you. I hear an echo though. So
Can
maybe
we-
that echo.
Can we work on that? I'm sure the technical team can help us.
Let me try again. Yeah, this is better now.
Brilliant.
Can you still hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
we can hear you.
fantastic. No, thanks a lot, Beatrice, and good afternoon, everyone, from early morning DC, sunshiny morning. So, Beatrice, the European welfare states are basically based on a contract between generations. So we have the young generation and the old generation that basically receive support from the welfare state arrangements that are funded by the working age population. And this intergenerational contract works well as long as the demographics are stable. But if the demographics are shifting because of low fertility that we have seen declining in Europe and also rising life expectancy, then there is a shift in the demographics that makes this welfare state model challenging. And what we've seen, for instance, in Europe is that the share of people above age 65 is currently about 20%. And this will increase to close to 30% in about 25 years from now. So this obviously imposes a challenge. And what we also see is the ratio of people that depend, so the young and the old, relative to the ones that contribute, which is the working age population, will rise from about 35% now to about close to 60% in 25 years from now. So this sets the challenge, I guess, for the financing of the welfare state. And it affects both the spending side and the revenue side. On the spending side, the European Commission has a series of studies where they estimate the age-related expenditures in the member states of the European Union. And on average, what they find is that if policy does not change, because of aging, we will see an increase in expenditures by 2.5% of GDP in the next 25 years. So this gives an idea of the challenge on the spending side. But also on the revenue side, we will see consequences because older people work less, they save less, they consume differently. So this will also have implications for revenue mobilization. So this is where you see the challenge coming. And I think for taxation, this means two things. One is, what will be the impact of aging on the revenue base depends on the tax structure. And second, if there is not sufficient reform on the spending side, there will be a need for increased revenue mobilization to finance all this. So it raises a number of tax policy issues for countries. There's issues about how to tax pensions. There's issues about the mix between direct taxes and indirect taxes. There's issues about taxation of labor income versus capital income. So this is all on the agenda. And essentially, this is about the intergenerational contract itself. So should the burden of the future expenditures be on the working age population, or should it also be shared across the population, including the elderly? So this is in a nutshell how I see sort of the challenge in terms of public finances.
Very valid questions that we might like to try to answer today, indeed, because we see that all those changes affect to the tax peaks that we have at the moment that might not be actually working in the longer term with all those social and labor changes that we're going to see as a result of aging. Talking about working longer, about how the labor market is changing as a result of aging, I would like to ask Maria, what are the trends that you have identified as in how aging impacts the labor market, and especially in the longer term, what are we going to see?
I think Commissioner Schmidt rightly highlighted the kind of profound changes we've observed in the labour market over the past 20 years, and that we'll continue to see, that are mainly driven by technological changes and globalisation. But demographic shifts as well have a huge impact in the structure of the labour market. And what we've seen over the past 20 years, we've been talking a lot about age dependency ratios, so the ratio between working age population and those above 65. But when we talk about working age population, not all of them have an earned income. Like, a lot of people don't work, they're inactive. And this has importance in terms of the tax base, of the capacity to actually pay taxes. And what we've seen over the past 20 years is a huge, actually a very impressive increase in employment rates for the older age groups, and especially for women. So we have a changing age pyramid, from a pyramid to more kind of a square or even inverse pyramid. Within that working age pyramid, we've seen a huge shift in terms of employment rates for what we would call older workers, those 50 and above. For women from 92 to 2021, it has gone from something like 38% to 62%. And for men, a little bit less impressive, I think 61 to 73. So we have seen this capacity actually to get more people into the labour market and stay in the labour market above 50 years old. And I think that's not something that's happened in all member states. It's happened in a lot of member states, but there are still member states where there's scope to kind of see how can we actually get a larger part of the working age population into gainful paid employment for a longer period. But we've seen a very an impressive increase in employment rates, especially on the higher age groups. And I think it's non-neglectable also as we move forward in terms of thinking about the aging population, is how can we maintain that, and how can we even ensure that we can promote it a little bit more. And that comes back to something that Commissioner Schmidt was mentioning as well, is the quality of the job. And at Eurofound, we have this concept of what we call sustainable work, which is about making work sustainable over the entire life course. And here we know that workers in different age groups meet different challenges in terms of having sustainable work, in terms of being able to actually have long working careers in a meaningful way.
We can have also a look at the implications that might have in other sectors as well, in terms of social protection system, but also social services that might have been given by elderly people that were unemployed, but now if they stay longer in jobs, that also has an impact on other forms of care.
That's then the labour demand. I was very much focused on the labour supply side of it. On the labour demand, the demographic shifts also has huge implications in terms of the structure as they create a new labour demand. And this is especially where we see large increases in labour demand in the health and residential care services. And this is going to continue as we move forward. And currently we already have a labour supply in these services, and that means that and some of it is very much attached to the job quality side of these jobs. And that is something that one needs to engage with.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn now to Agnieszka for the tax aspect of those changes. How do you see aging impacting the tax mix that we have, and how do we tackle those challenges by reforming our tax system?
What we see is not only that people work more, but that the jobs become more and more diversified. So we see a lot of jobs like platform workers, gig economy, atypical types of jobs, which are not always covered by the traditional social security contributions. So what we already see in as far as trends in financing social protection, that in many countries this financing relies more on taxes rather than social security contributions. And definitely this is the one way to see if working age population is shrinking, if ability to raise social security contributions that are levied directly on wages becomes more and more difficult. If people do not have sufficient job spells to have a pension, then the question is raised, what kind of protection can we provide? And this means that many countries right now introduce social pensions or sort of guarantees of income for the old age that are financed from taxes. So we might see a movement towards more tax-financed social protection vis-a-vis financed directly on wages, because jobs and labor force becomes scarcer.
And also maybe a capital tax like we were talking about before with Mr. Angel as well.
That could be capital tax, that could be indirect taxes. So there are different kinds of taxes. Important thing is that when we look at social protection expenditure, so when we move to transfers, we see that a lot of transfers are driven by age. So a lot of public transfers go especially towards the older age population. This includes pensions, but also healthcare expenditure. For the young population, their consumption is financed partially by public transfers, education, health, but also family transfers. I mean, parents support their children. So that is why it is very important to look at the age structure and the fact that we will have more and more old people. That means that there will be a need to find ways to provide them with sufficient income and also healthcare and other long-term care services that have been mentioned before.
Indeed. I would like to remind our audience that this is an open conversation. We want to hear from you. We want you to ask the questions that you would like to ask to our speakers today. So please go and type slido.com or use the QR code that you're going to find on your screen and use the hashtag TaxMix2050 at the end of the conference. I'm sure I'm going to remember the hashtag. And please share your questions with us so that we can transmit them to our speakers today. While I wait for people to share their questions, I would like to have maybe a quick follow-up with Ruud, because we have a very European perspective today. Inevitably, we're here in Brussels. Most of us work at the European Union, but you work on the IMF, so you have a different experience. You work with all kinds of countries. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about how those same issues that we are seeing now in Europe have been tackled by other countries around the world.
Thank you, Beatrice. Well, aging is a global phenomenon. You see it in many other parts of the world as well, and particularly in Asia. But the issues that arise, of course, depend not only on the demographics, it depends also on the structure of the welfare states. That imposes at least the implications for public finances. I think a very interesting example for Europe is Japan, because Japan is aging earlier and more significantly than European countries. So we've seen a very large drop in fertility rates in Japan in the past. We've also seen a very high life expectancy of Japanese. It's, for instance, 6 years older on average than the average European age. And it's also earlier. So we have seen, for instance, I just mentioned the share of people above 65 in Europe, which is now 20%, will increase to close to 30%. In Japan, it's already almost 30%, and it will increase to 40%. So Japan is, the aging issue is more severe. And what we have seen in Japan is the implications of this. So the shrinking working age population has consequences for economic growth. and which has been very low, and people are calling this shrinkonomics, the very low growth of the economy. But we've also seen responses to it. So labor-saving technologies. So digitalisation is very prominent and taking over basically human tasks more rapidly than elsewhere. And we've seen also that the participation rate of those right beneath the retirement age, let's say between 55 and 64, in Japan is very high, much higher even than in Europe. It's close to 80%. So there are sort of necessary responses that come with aging to make the welfare state model sustainable, and we've seen that Japan has responded in this way. The challenge in other countries, for instance, other Asian countries, is different because they have different welfare state arrangements. But aging is happening almost everywhere, but not leading to the same challenges as they lead to in Europe.
Indeed, that's a very interesting picture. How do you see this issue compared to the changes in the labor market that are happening in Europe? And I know that you're an expert more on the labor side of the story, but how do you see these intervening with the need to reform the tax system? What challenges might come up of these labor changes that you have identified?
I mean, we've had a long-standing discussion about the fact that a large part of the tax revenue comes out of labor income, and a long discussion about whether this is the right proportion. And as we saw early on today, there's a call to from European citizens to more go towards tax evasion, find other tax sources than labor income, which when you're going towards an aging population seems the right time actually to have this discussion in depth and have a real talk about how are we going to reweigh the way that we actually bring in tax revenue. And I think some of the ideas that were put on the table in terms of tax evasion, the issue how can we use the green transition, also in terms of rethinking how can we help the tax system to incentivize the behaviors that will take us towards a climate neutral economy, and how can that then help us to engage with the shrinking tax base because the workforce is shrinking. So I think these this is the right moment to have these kind of conversations in terms of how to have this kind of tax shift. But what we've also heard today, and I think that's very important, is a part of the tax one of the main ideas behind taxing labor income was also that it should be progressive, right? Mm. So it should have some kind of redistributive function, whether it being social contributions or whether it being direct taxation. But when we move to the other forms of taxing, whether it be incentivizing the right behavior to go towards the climate neutral economy, there the issue of installing a progressive tax system becomes much more difficult and much less evident. And I think that one needs to be very careful when one shifts the tax basis, that there is a thought about how progressive the tax or regressive the tax system actually remains. But I think it's clearly the right moment to have this discussion.
Indeed. What do you think about this? Do you think that one of the main challenges going ahead is indeed making sure that that new tax system is progressive enough so that we make sure that we contribute to a fairer society, even though we have to definitely shift completely the tax system as we know it?
Well, we will probably have to shift the tax system as we know it, because Europe for a long time had this demographic dividend. That means that the number of people in working age was rising much more quickly than those in non-working age, either youth or the old. And that is something that is changing in some of the countries, like particularly Central and Eastern European countries. This change is really very quick. And tax systems is, of course, a part of the story. The other part is reforming the pension systems. That also happens. So, for example, retirement ages have been increased and people do work longer, which was already mentioned. Mm. Just a part of the consequences of raising retirement ages. And definitely, this is again something that has to be looked at. In order to balance this generational contract that exists, we have to look at both sides of the equation, the taxes that are paid and the benefits that are paid out. but definitely we need to think about how to structure the tax system so that it is a sustainable model in the long run that doesn't induce trying to not comply or not be covered by social security, which happens these days too. So it is very important to have both stable and sustainable tax system, but also benefit systems that are sustainable in the light of population aging.
Not to leave anyone behind, considering also that the question of fair labor conditions. Ruud, what's your view on this one? How do you think that we need to structure our tax system moving forward to make sure that it's progressive enough, but also that it tackles the challenges of aging?
Thanks, Beatrice. No, this is exactly the trade-off. So on the one hand, we want to have progressive tax systems because this is the way I think it's the most fair and equitable. But on the other hand, the aging basically pushes us towards shifting the tax. And it's interesting, again, to look at Japan. In Japan, the discussion on tax has been focused on two things. One is increase the value-added tax, which was pretty low. So, but this is a tax that is relatively robust to aging. It's because the older people tend to consume out of their savings. So the base of the consumption tax is more robust than the labor income tax base. And second, there is a lot of debate on the taxation of capital income. And I think that this is an area where there's a lot of discussion in Europe, but basically around the world. Taxing wealth, taxing capital incomes is sort of on a revival, I would say. So we've seen over the last decades that taxes on capital have been reduced. And that was because it was so difficult to tax capital incomes because of the evasion and countries basically found it difficult to have information about offshore accounts and so on. So taxing capital income has been very difficult. And in response, countries have reduced taxes on capital income. But I think there is sort of increasing debate for a revival of taxation of capital income, both because it is now more feasible, because we now have exchange of information, which is taking off, which facilitates the enforcement of taxes on capital income better. But also the issues about inclusive tax policy have come more to prominence. So I do think that an effective way of taxing capital income is high on the agenda, will be very high on the agenda. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement. If you look at individual country tax systems, there are so many loopholes still present in taxing capital income that there is significant room for improvement. And that is both supporting taxation in an era of aging, and it contributes to an inclusive way of taxation, which I think both are going to be very important going forward.
Indeed, we heard about that before during our interview with Mr. Angel about this importance of tackling tax evasion, which is absolutely key. We want to put capital at the core of finances of our social protection system. We have a couple of questions coming from the audience. The first one is coming from Sebastian. He is asking, should different types of revenues be used to finance aging expenditure linked to pensions and health, such as pensions via higher social security contributions, health via general taxation? What's your view on this? Maybe, Agnieszka, you would like to react on this one?
Well, I mean, it very much depends on how welfare systems are designed. We see many countries that finance health through taxation, but also many countries that have social security contributions and various co-payments from individuals. As far as pensions are concerned, again, we have either pensions that are earnings related that are levied mainly on social security contributions, but we also have pension systems like in Denmark when we have citizens' pensions, which is financed partially from taxes. So I think it is important to have a very sustainable tax benefit mix, and the way how it is designed depends of course on how the welfare system in the country is designed, which is a sort of a path dependency that we need to take into account, but definitely various sources of taxes should be considered when thinking about this tax benefit mix.
Of course. Maria, how do you see the situation in which we have more needs of revenues while at the same time we have a shrinking working class, or in the longer term but with different benefits as well? How do you see this dichotomy, and where do you think that money should be found?
Once again, I think it depends on how the welfare state is put together. Okay, I think in some countries it's fairly easy. No, fairly easy. Okay, it's maybe easier to enlarge the tax base on which you can finance your welfare state if it's tax based. Whereas in countries where it's very much based on social security contributions, you would maybe continue with the social security contributions, and then you would add on other more tax-based revenue coming from other sources, like we're talking about now, capital gains, the CO2, the greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth, that you can kind of add to the system. But you would try to find kind of a financing mix. I think it's maybe more difficult when you are in a social contribution system where the system has been put together so you contribute and then you receive to a certain extent to go complete to a tax-based financing. Or at least the path will be fairly long. You would need to have a path that goes that way. But I think to continue, for example, health, yeah, they are age-related, but they're not only. I mean, having a good healthcare system benefits everybody. It benefits the workforce, it benefits the economy. Having a healthy workforce makes you more productive and so forth. So, being on a waiting list to get your hip replaced, it's very costly for the individual, but for society as well. Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, I think there's a stronger argument to say that health should be financed out of all taxes, because it contributes to kind of the well-being and the productivity of the entire society. And pensions, it will very much depend on how the system has been put together and where you want to end up.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point indeed, because it goes beyond aging. It's something that society is going to need no matter what. Ruth, what's your view on this? Do you think that we have to find ways indeed to find a balance between those social security contributions and pensions, healthcare system? Where do you see the tax mix here?
Yeah, I think what has been said, I fully agree with. Maybe just to add, I think in terms of pensions, one tax-related issue that is very important is how we treat pensions for taxation. And you see that some countries, the contributions that people make are tax deductible. And then once the pensions are paid out, and the pensions are seen as basically deferred labor income, then they are taxed. Now, these systems, you see that if the population ages, then when people retire, they still pay tax. So these systems are sort of, in that sense, protected against the shrinking of the tax base as a result of aging, compared to countries that have already taxed these incomes once it was earned, and where pensions are basically saved out of net income. So I think the systems do matter for the degree in which aging affects the tax base, and I think this is also something that is related to who is going to pay ultimately for the rising cost of expenses related to aging, on which the others have already responded.
Some systems are a little bit more resilient and more sustainable in the longer term than others. We have another question coming from the audience, and has the huge expected climate migration from younger population been considered on the future predictions? And I think this is very relevant for Europe, because migration has been one of the elements of the discussion, especially when we talk about aging population, when we talk to the changes in the labor market and taxation as well. So I was wondering if this is something Eurofund is looking into, maybe, Maria?
I would not say that we're particularly looking into it per se, but it is one of the factors. I mean, you do have different scenarios where you will have a high migration scenario, low migration scenario, and so forth. But look, so in that sense, it is a part of when you try to see what's going on in the labour market, you try to project, high migration, low migration scenarios are taken into consideration. Now, and of course, if you have a high migration scenario, things look slightly better, but they look slightly better. Like, it's not going to solve the problem. Okay, I think that's it. And if we look back at what we see has happened with the high migration waves that we've had over the past 20 years, it also has an importance of where do the migration waves situate themselves in the structure of the labour market. And some of the countries where we have a very polarized labour market, like low income part of the labour market and then high income part of the labour market, these are countries that have had massive waves of migration coming in. I'm talking about Spain and talking about UK. So I'm not saying they only slide into the lower end of the labour market, but there is a tendency for waves of migration to take a certain time before they kind of filter all over the economy. And that comes into, you get the waves of migration in. That's going to help definitely in terms of having the aging workforce. It will certainly help in terms of the sectors that need to grow, whether it be high tech, whether it be care and so forth. But it's not going to solve the problem. It's going to alleviate it over a certain period.
Also because we might find,
migrants, if they contribute to social security systems,
they benefit.
They take benefits as well. So they will also take out pensions once they reach retirement age. So it is not taking care of the problem. If we have more migrants, it's sort of postponing the consequences. But
also integrating them in the labour market would be a way to ensure that they contribute to the system as well.
Absolutely.
Right? Indeed. Maybe, Ruth, you would like to comment on this one, because you work with countries that origin, transit and destination of migrant people. And how do you see these impacting those countries as well? Because we're talking about the benefits that European countries might have, but that also has an impact on the development of certain countries as well, right?
Yeah, it is. It does matter. But as was said, maybe not too much. What we see, for instance, in Japan is that migration is very low. So this is one of the reasons why the numbers in Japan are much more dramatic in some other countries. In the US, there is more migration, and this sort of relieves these numbers in terms of dependency ratios. I think what is important to note also is what type of migration countries pursue, what kind of migration policy is in place. If you're very selective and you select young, educated people, those contribute more than they receive, probably, compared to maybe other forms of migration. And I think the type of migration policy will also matter for the degree in which it relieves the impact of aging.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I'm going to remind the audience that they can still ask questions if they want. Go to slido.com, use tax mix 2050, and we're going to be hearing from you and bringing those questions into the conversation. Now, Maria, I was wondering if there are any concrete measures that can be taken that indirectly would help to tackle the consequences of aging through the tax system.
Or through the tax system. I can think of plenty of other things, but
go ahead. That's fine too.
Okay. No, I think if we're going as we have an aging population, there are 2 or 3 things that seem kind of as being a priority. One is to, as I mentioned before, the sustainable work agenda. And I think this is something we need to take really seriously, and we need to take it serious from the younger cohorts, because now we focus on all the workers that we want them to remain longer in the labour market. So what we're going to do now, but that's actually not when it starts. It starts when you enter the labour market, and one needs to deal with the issues at stake for the different age cohorts, and they're not the same. And going back to what you were mentioning, Agnieszka, before with regard to the hybridization of our labor market, with regard to the gig economy and so forth, what we see is the younger generation are coming in on much more, I wouldn't say precarious terms, but with less job security. And that's having a negative impact on them. So it is really a strain for the younger cohorts going into the labor market and having less of this job prospect, job security. And I think it's something that we need to take really serious at that point to get young people in a good position so that they can contribute to the social protection system, right? We then get to the middle cohort where it's really work-life balance, which is the stress factor, like the big sustainable work issue. And at the later age stage, it's training. It's lifelong learning and it's training, being able to maintain being in your job. And if you lose your job, being able to find a new job, because I think that's really for the older workers the biggest problem. You lose your job, you don't find a new one. And I think this agenda of sustainable work and figuring it out for all age cohorts, we really should be at the forefront as we walk into an aging society. And the second issue is about getting everybody into being a contributing factor to the welfare state in one way or the other, and not having statuses that for some reason do not contribute for whatever reason it's being. And then I'm going back to the recommendation that I've come in on from the European institutions on social protection for all. And I think it's very important to think that one through and think for each country, what does that actually mean for my system to ensure that everybody's a part of the social protection system? What is it I need to put in place in terms of job status, in terms of contributions and so forth, so we all contribute. Of course, then at a later stage, we'll all benefit, but that's what we actually want. We want people to be able to benefit from the welfare state. So I think those would be my, not so much latter point is taxation. So yeah,
they
I'll stop there.
absolutely do. And actually what I wanted to ask Agnieszka about this is that indeed we're talking here about how difficult it is to reform a tax system, and that the issues that we're discussing are short term, but indeed the way in which we shape our labor market now is going to have a huge impact in the future, and that also means an impact on the tax system. So moving forward, how do you see these issues that Maria just highlighted about the labor market conditions, the social security and social protection systems, and all those challenges that our young generation is facing, that is going to have consequences as well in the future?
Well, I think it is very important to first explain the benefits of social protection also for the young people, because young people, when they enter the labor market, they don't think a lot about social protection and about their pensions that are due in a very long period of time. And I know that many youth organizations are pointing out to the need to really have this kind of financial literacy, pension literacy, which brings understanding why social protection is important, why it is important to think about it already when people enter the labor market, and why it is important to explain the benefits of this intergenerational contract and building trust towards intergenerational contract, which is a tax benefit system in every single country. So this is one thing. The other thing that I believe is important is to think about the quality of jobs, but we haven't talked a lot about the technological change. Technology can improve the efficiency and productivity a lot, and I think that once we have less people that are potentially on the labor market, it is very important also to think about how to improve their productivity through supporting with technology. Technology is not something that steals jobs. It is rather something that can improve the quality of jobs, the quality of the productivity, thus the wages and the basis from which the social security contributions are levied. So this is important. And I fully agree, lifelong learning and being aware that, I mean, first we change jobs, second we may have to learn new things in order to continue working for longer periods of time. It is very important, and it's not only for the people in their 40s, but it starts early. Basically, as we leave our schools, universities, we should think about how we further develop our skills, how we change our skills, because the requirements on the labor market change immensely all the time.
So labor security might be about labor mobility. It doesn't necessarily need to be having the same contract for the rest of your life, but being able to be resilient to the changes in the labor market. We have a couple of questions coming from the audience. One of them is, what could be the revenue potential of inheritance taxes due to population aging, which is something that has become a key element to the discussion in Europe. So maybe Agnieszka, would you like to react on this one?
Well, I don't think that inheritance tax can fill the gap to a large extent. So there are different discussions, maybe not on inheritance taxes, but for example, of how to use housing that people have in order to support their old age income through reverse mortgages or other instruments, but these not fly very much. So at the end of the day, I wouldn't seek really the solution in inheritance taxes.
Doesn't have a lot of future. Ruud, have you looked into this one? Do you think that this can be an element that could contribute to the tax revenue?
I do think it can contribute definitely to resolving these issues. What we see in countries around the world is that inheritance taxes don't raise much revenue. I think the average is about 0.1% of GDP. But that is mainly because of the design. These systems are often designed in a way that it's very easy to avoid or to evade these taxes. And avoidance is a matter of design. So these systems have all types of loopholes that you can have the inheritance arranged through trusts, which are then tax exempt and so on. So by design, I think they don't raise much revenue, but there are some countries that raise about 0.6, 0.7% of GDP that have done a better job in designing them. And I think these kind of contributions, even if it's 0.5% of GDP, do matter. And I think it's going to be more important in light of aging, where there will be more inheritances transferred to the younger generations. And this is a tax that can really contribute to reducing intergenerational inequality. It's also a tax that is relatively efficient from an economic perspective. So I think it would make sense if countries pay more attention. And I see this as part of sort of the taxation of wealth and capital income. I think this is an area where they should pay more attention, and there is an important contribution to basically increase. Although it's not a game changer, I agree with Agnieszka. This is not going to resolve the entire problem, but all the small bits I think do help.
Considering the size of the challenge, indeed, everything counts. But of course, it wouldn't change completely the picture. We have another question coming from the audience. And if the question is, if one considers a wealth tax, should tax take into consideration the wealth origin? Should wealth arising from labor income deserve different treatment? What do you think, Agnieszka? It's a huge one.
It's another tricky question. I think these are blurred lines between what is wealth arising from labor income and what is wealth arising from other sources, because when the labor income is used to invest into the company, for example, and then the company develops and wealth comes from that, it can become tricky to really diversify, and I basically believe in simple solutions. So the simpler the design of the taxes is, that probably benefits to how the revenue can be gained. If we think about very complex tax systems, probably that would also mean that there are very different loops through which people don't pay taxes, or trying to name things differently. So well, I'm not a tax expert, but I would say that probably it would be very difficult to design such systems.
So we are running out of time. We have a couple more minutes, and I would like to have a last round of remarks from all of you. So we're going to start with Ruud, and the question is going to be the same for everybody. What is the main challenge that you see in aging and the potential impact for taxation, and how do you think that the EU could actually tackle that challenge?
So we've discussed basically the size of the challenge that countries are facing. I think in terms of taxation, we've discussed issues of capital income taxation, the shift from direct to indirect taxes, the tax of pensions. I do see a role for the EU, in particular, where there are important spillovers between countries. So if a tax by one country has implications for the tax base of other countries. And we do see that in particular in corporate income taxation, where the spillovers are very large, where there is, I think, an important role for the EU to play. But we increasingly see that also for the personal income tax, where with the increasing remote work and so on, basically labor is becoming more mobile across borders. And if that's the case, we also see that countries are designing schemes to attract certain types of labor, special regimes for soccer players, special regimes for artists, for very wealthy individuals, citizenship for investment schemes. I think these are spillovers that do call for a strong role for the EU to play in the design of tax systems to determine the rules of the game, essentially, under which individual countries can set their tax systems.
This is key to the competition within the single market. So that's a great point that I'm sure the Commission is going to take. Maria, what do you think is the main challenge and how do we tackle at EU level?
So I think I'm coming in from the labour market perspective then, more than the tax, but it's of course interlinked. I think it's ensuring, as we have an aging population, that their needs in the silver economy is met. That can be high tech, it can be all the e-health and so forth, but it's also very much with regard to basic care. There's going to be a growing demand with regard to this, the basic care. And it's how to construct a system so that there's not too much competition for the workforce across Europe, which there will be, but also to ensure that we actually have quality jobs in the care sector, which is a real issue right now, is to ensure that we got the quality jobs so we can attract the workforce to provide the quality care that we need. And then the challenge is actually to find a tax system that can finance this.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm turning myself to Agnieszka now. What do you think is the main challenge and how do we make sure that indeed that tax system is fit for purpose?
Well, I think that the main challenge is that it's very uncertain we have population projections. We know how populations will potentially evolve, but the issue is that we haven't ever lived in a world of the aging population. So this is something that has been not experienced by any of the European economies before. We can look at Japan, which is a little bit further ahead, but I think this is the largest challenge, that it is something that was not experienced. So we have to design solutions that are for something that we don't know fully. The second issue is that people do live longer, and we observe many problems that are related to the very old age, such as dementia and other problems that are related to cognitive abilities that requires long-term care. And many of the countries don't have very well-designed long-term care solutions, including financing. So I think financing, having people that work in a care sector and then well-designed long-term care as a part of a system is definitely something that I believe all European economies will have to deal with.
The importance of having exchanges between different countries with different systems that they can contribute to a common solution. Thank you so much, Agnieszka, Maria, Ruth. Thank you so much for joining us in this discussion. We keep on going, but we're going to take a short break. But before we go into the coffee break and before we move into the next panel, I leave you with a video message from Pascal SAINT-AMANS, Director for the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD.
Dear all, sorry not to be with you in person, but happy to contribute on this important question of the future of tax in the future society. And to be very quick, I would like to identify 3 challenges in the coming years. There are many more, but I would like to put the focus on 3 of them. I mean, the first one maybe belongs to the past already, but it's the digitalization of the economy and the tax challenges related to the digitalization of the economy. And I see 2 or 3 dimensions there. The first one is obvious. That's about the deal we concluded on the 8th of October 2021, concluding years of negotiation to update the international tax system and make sure that companies would be taxable in countries even where they do not have a physical presence, but where they derive important profit from. So the deal that was reached at the OECD, in addition to providing for a global minimum tax of at least 15% effective, was about reallocating a quarter of the rent of the largest multinational companies, in particular the digital companies, to the market jurisdiction. So that's the first fall, which is obvious, even though we still need to deliver the implementation of this Pillar 1, because this is how we call it, but that has been and that remains a big challenge for the international tax community. The second aspect of the digitalization is related to the modernization of tax administration, big data, artificial intelligence, how they can use this data to provide for compliance by design, facilitating the life of taxpayers and tax administration. There is a big project at the OECD called Administration 3.0 from the Forum on Tax Administration, gathering more than 50 tax commissioners who really want to leverage on this and see what the best practices are. So digitalization obviously is still a serious challenge ahead of us. The second challenge for tax systems will be climate change. This is more than a challenge for tax system, it's a challenge for humankind, and tax will have to play a role. And we see that it's not an easy proposition. I mean, the role that tax can play is about taxing carbon emissions, and what we can see is this paradox where everybody agrees, at least all the economists agree, that we must have a price on carbon to price the negative externality on climate change, and therefore change the behavior to decarbonize faster. And at the same time, every time a government is trying to move, there is social turmoil. It's very difficult. There are a few success stories, but that's a big challenge. So addressing the climate change challenge with smart tax system, which will, at the end of the day, manage to put or to contribute putting a price on carbon emissions while incentivizing the transformation of the economy towards a greener economy is obviously the big challenge. And the OECD will be present there. The OECD ministers have just agreed a few days ago, the establishment of an inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches, which will be a mechanism, an inclusive mechanism with OECD and non-OECD countries to come together, try to identify what is the explicit price of carbon, the effective price of carbon with excise duties, comparing it between countries, but also trying to see what is the abatement cost of some measures and what is the implicit price of carbon on non-price-based mitigation measures. And this data may allow countries to move further to address climate change. The third element I wanted to highlight today is about aging population, which will also have a massive impact. Aging population in many countries, developed countries in particular, which will raise, even though this phenomenon has started some time ago, but which is raising interesting tax questions on the redistribution of wealth through transmissions, in inheritance, for instance. What will be the role of inheritance duties in this aging society that we are living in, and what is the proper taxation of the income of pensioners, and what are the right deductions for the contribution of pension funds and others. These are long time question, but which will have to be revisited in the coming years. So just to give you some hints on what we think the governments will be working on in the European Union, in the OECD, and more globally across the world: digitalisation, climate change, aging population. I'm pretty sure we could add many, especially given the hardship which is ahead of us with returning inflation, with the slowdown of the economy, with a shortage of a number of goods and maybe of employment as well. But that will be for another one. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to those of you who just joined, and welcome back to those who have been following this conference organized by DigiTax, where we are talking about megatrends and their impact on taxation. And for this panel, we're going to be talking about digitalization and globalization, how it has changed the way we do business, the way we consume, but also the changes in the labor market, and how all those changes affect the way that we do taxes, and that indeed we need to adapt those tax systems to make sure that we tackle the challenges that globalization and digitalization bring. And for that, I'm very happy to welcome live Ilias Libanos, who is an expert at the Department for Vet and Skills at the European Centre for Development of Vocational Education and Guidance. We are also being joined live by Rita de la Feira, who is Professor of Tax Law at the University of Leeds. And I have here with me Lydia Pereira, who is a member of the European Parliament and a member of the Economic Affairs Committee. Thank you so much, the three of you, for joining me today. Now, I would like to start with Ilias, because I know you have conducted a report on skills and employment trends for 2030. And I was wondering, what are the main findings of that report, and how do you think they can affect taxation? We can't hear you.
We keep observing for a number of years, including upskilling, digitalization, automation, and so on. And all these relate to the demand side in the economy. But what I'm most concerned, and I'm not the only one, is what happens in the supply side, where aging seems to be the biggest problem. But let me try to explain what is the problem here in simple terms. So think that we have the workforce and think about it as a spinning top. Like a good spinning top is thick in the middle, and it is thin on top and on the bottom. So let's say that the middle is the core workforce, say age 35 to 55, the top is the group 55 plus, and the bottom is workers up to 35. Now imagine that the time passes, your spinning top keeps spinning, but by 2030 your middle has become thinner and your top has become thicker. So this is not good for your spinning top, and your spinning top is eventually going to stop. So the point here is that it's good to discuss about how to extend working life and provide incentives to stay at work, so the top becomes thicker. But the main issue is that the workforce will eventually start shrinking as the middle part of the workforce, or your spinning top, becomes thinner. And more or less, this is what happens in EU at the moment. And we know that by 2030, all baby boomers will have retired, and that most EU member states will see their overall participation rates falling. So if we take these trends for granted, then what are the implications on future tax revenues? And we know that if we think of the structure of the labor force in terms of age groups and also employment by skill level, this will determine the future of tax revenues, and the trend I just described, I think it should be taken very seriously into consideration.
Thank you so much for that, because indeed one of the key elements that we have been discussing over the past hour was aging, and we will be looking at how those combines with indeed digitalization and globalization can have a huge impact on the tax system. Now, I wanted to go back to digitalization. I wanted to bring Rita for this one. What do you think is the impact of digitalization for the tax system?
Well, the truth is that the tax system is built for a physical and territorial world. So when digitalization and globalization start happening, it affected actually all areas of the tax system. So we have tended over the last few years to concentrate on corporate income tax and the impact of digitalization and globalization on corporate income tax. But in reality, these challenges are challenges that affect all taxes. And going forward, I think the kind of big issue that we will have to face will be the mobility of labor and how people work across borders. So this was already mentioned in the previous panel in passing, but the digitalization of the economy has accelerated extensively during the pandemic. We buy a lot more online, which has consequences for VAT, and we work now interjurisdictionally, which has consequences for personal income taxes. And I think that the competition that we are starting to see on personal income taxes as regards these schemes that are appearing for, high earners like footballers or artists, etc., is just the beginning of these challenges that we're going to face. So it's the first response to this increase on mobility of labor. And going forward, what we want to avoid is really a situation where we slip into a kind of race to the bottom that we witnessed with corporate income taxes, also on personal income taxes, because as the race to the bottom of that scale, for the reasons that were discussed already in the previous panel as well, in terms of aging of the population, would have much bigger societal consequences, much bigger economic consequences than the mobility of capital that we have witnessed so far. So in European countries, we are very reliant on VAT, we're very reliant on personal income taxes, in broad terms, to include social security contributions, etc. So the consequences in terms of revenue, but also from a societal perspective, of any shakeup, of any redistribution that we might have as a consequence of the increased mobility of labor, will affect European countries and across the world as well. But European countries certainly will be very affected by these changes.
When we talk about these, the clarity is that we need to reform our tax system. So we are going to be talking more concretely about what changes do we need to do to be able to tackle those challenges. But I wanted to turn now to Lydia, because the European Parliament has limited capacity when it comes to contributing to this debate. So how do you think the Parliament can accompany these tasks, these enormous tasks that European governments have ahead?
Yeah, indeed, tax policy is a matter of sovereignty. So indeed, the Parliament has limited competences, and we have a framework of co-legislation. But in other fields, in particular on taxation, it's up to the Council to decide in unanimity about taxation policies. But saying this and picking on what was said by the previous speakers, when we talk about taxation, indeed it's a territorial image that we have, so hence the reason of sovereignty. But the truth is that we are going forward with a more globalized world. We've achieved a deal on OECD, so more targeting the multinational taxation and so on. But the truth is that within the limited capacity of the European Parliament, we've been putting forward what are the views, because it's the only democratic institution elected in the framework of the European institutions, and where we've been putting up our opinions in the several reports that we have. And we tell the Council what is the view of the Parliament on the different matters. In particular, for example, if we talk about tax evasion, anti-money laundering, and so on. So we need an institutional change as well. If we are moving towards a more integrated, and we cannot forget or neglect the fact that we have a single market that is potentially facing some distortions, as Rita didn't say this, but there's tax competition, which is good, as long as tax competition is fair, loyal, and transparent. So I think the challenges we have connected as well with the demographic trend, which is very serious and which has not been addressed concretely, coming from a country, Portugal, that is probably going to be one of the oldest countries in the coming years. It's particularly relevant if we think about social security systems, and in the end of the day, of the European social model. So how we can pay the European social model in 2050, because we also have the digital transition and we have the green transition. So it's too many things that we have to cope with. Given the limited space the Parliament has, we do our job. But we also need some sort of engagement from the Council, because when we vote on an opinion, a position of the Parliament on tax matters, the Council can also be more responsive or open to the view of the institution. Then, just to conclude, and having in mind that taxation is primarily a national competence, and hence discussed in the Council. What we have seen, in particular on the discussions on the OECD agreement, seeing that there's a veto from Hungary, well, then it's up to the Council to manage it. But we are talking about a political veto, which might be kind of a mean of exchange for something else. So it has to be very clear what is the direction that Europe wants to take. And in a more globalized world, it makes no sense that we are taking more individualistic approaches. But this is a political discussion, and the Council here has to be firm, not putting in as a second discussion that we need tax competition. But as I said, and I want to underline, it has to be fair, loyal, and transparent.
Better cooperation between member states to make sure that this is fair indeed. I want to remind the audience that we are taking questions live from Slido. So if you would like to ask a question to our speakers today, you can go and type TaxMix 2050 or use the QR code that you are going to find on your screen, and then you will get access to our page straight away and you can share your questions there. I want to follow up on Elias, because you touch upon aging particularly, but I was wondering, what are the trends that you see as a result of digitalization in the labor market, and how do you think that can have an impact on the tax mix?
So there is a long-standing fear that technology will replace workers, but I would say that technology and AI, it's not something new. I would say that it is as old as work. For example, in Greek mythology, Ironsmith god Hephaestus had created AI servants to help him with his work. So time and again, there have been discussions about the impact of heavy machinery, microelectronics, and these days about robots. And let me remind you that about 100 years ago, Keynes said that work will only be a hobby in 100 years from his time, because technology will do most of the work. But here we are today working, and if anything, working more because of technology, and possibly having less time for hobbies than we had before. So it is true that many jobs and tasks will be automated, and that we may not need to replace all of these workers that will be retiring, as some of these tasks and jobs will be taken over by robots, and perhaps this trend is more intense now. And maybe we're going over a shock period now, so it is even more intensive. But what we need to think is that technology is not just a job distractor, but it is also a job creator. And let me give you an example. In car manufacturing, with the introduction of clean vehicles, we need less workers to produce them, because the assembly lines are simpler. But there are many jobs that are being created also in sectors where supporting the production of clean vehicles. So all in all, some jobs are being lost, some jobs are being created. And overall, we maintain an equilibrium in employment. And hopefully, workers now can free up time and focus on more creative and less automated and routine tasks. Nevertheless, of course, there are implications on tax revenues, and definitely some adjustments will need to be made as less workers, because of the introduction of machinery, would mean, of course, lower tax revenues.
But also, in terms of the impact on the labor market, we see, and we have discussed this before, the issue of long life learning, the question of upskilling and reskilling, because this is absolutely key for those workers to adapt to the changes, and that would require funding. Moving forward, how did you see this? Because indeed, we might have changes that might affect the labor market in terms of destroying jobs, but with the creation of new jobs, we also need to invest so that we have workers that are ready and resilient to change into this labor market. How do you see these two elements moving forward, and especially considering that taxation might be a source of funding for that investment?
Indeed, and mobility here is creating other types of jobs which leave or which take benefit or take advantage of the said mobility, in particular the digital nomads. I think the pandemic, when we say that we want to go back to the old normal, the fact is that the pandemic has shown different new trends which are going to be the new normal, and the new normal is having more and more digital nomads. So what we need to do is to make sure that there's in terms of European exchange of information, for example, administrative cooperation, that there's sufficient resilience as well, but innovation, or we take advantage of the innovation put on the market to make sure that everyone pays their fair share of taxes. But I do believe that we are witnessing a big opportunity, which comes with challenges and with some risks, which has to be correctly measured by the different stakeholders involved, in particular the national tax authorities, but under the umbrella of cooperation that we have led by the European Commission, for example. But I do see a big potential with the digitalization and new jobs, and I don't like to have this negative image of destroying jobs, because I believe this transition, any transition is usually hard, but I see more potential than the negative side. So I think we really need to combine both, making sure that we take advantage of the mobility in the job market at the moment.
Absolutely. I wanted to go back to Rita, because we have a question coming from the audience that I think fits very much into this chat that we are having about work mobility and taxation. And it's, how will we be able to ensure fairness in cross-border taxation with digitalization?
Yes, I'll respond to this question now, but if you don't mind, Beatriz, I would like to come back to the issue of automation, because I think that that is such a key issue going forward. On the fairness, this is a very good point, because what we know is that the workers that will be mobile will tend to be the high skilled at the top of the income distribution. So that will have an impact not only on revenues and the way they are allocated, because basically we, at this moment in time, we broadly tax where people reside. So if people reside in a different country, they will be taxed in a different country. So if they move the income from that revenue, the revenue that comes from that income will go to another country. Now, this will have an impact on their revenues, but as I say, because they are at the top of the income distribution, it also has a distributional effect. So it will affect the progressivity of the tax system if we start competing for those high income workers, because it will be left to the non-mobile workers to pay for the taxes. So I do see challenges, very big challenges ahead in terms of the mobility of workers and cross-border workers, in terms not only of the amount of revenue, but also in terms of the progressivity of the tax system. Now, if you don't mind, I'll come back to the issue of the automation, because I think that this is really a key issue going forward as well. So the majority of literature on this sides with what Elias and Lydia we're just highlighting about the midterm to long-term positive impact on productivity and welfare. But there is a short-term impact that has to be taken into consideration as well. So there will be probably effects, labor displacement effects in the short term as a result of automation, and it will be felt differently across different sectors, across different regions of the world. So what technically we would call, there is some heterogeneity going on. So we need to take this into account, because on the immediate future, even though going forward we might want to encourage automation, we might want to encourage innovation for increased productivity and welfare, we have to take into consideration that in the short term, this might affect not only the amount of revenue that we're going to get, but also the amount of money we're going to need for the upskilling. So the tax system will be squeezed on both sides. It might be squeezed on the side of the decrease of revenues, at the same time that is being squeezed on the side of needing to increase expenditure to deal with the need for upskilling, potential unemployment benefits, etc. So I do think that the personal income tax system is something that we need to pay a little bit more attention to in the coming years, because it has these two big challenges coming to a head. On one hand, the mobility of labor and the impact that the pandemic has had on remote working. On the other hand, the issue of automation that has been accelerated also as a result of technological developments during the pandemic. So I am also an optimist. I think that the future will be positive, but we need to take into consideration these short-term challenges. There are opportunities in terms of digitalization and automation for the tax system itself as well, which is something that I think that is interesting to discuss as well. But we need to take into consideration these short-term challenges. You know, sticking our heads in the sand is never a good policy in terms of tax policy, because reality has a way of catching up with you. So it's better to plan and to make sure that we have the right revenues to bring everyone with us than to be caught off guard a couple of years from now. Thank you, Beatrice.
And I'm going to have a couple of follow-ups for each and every one of you. But going back to what we were talking about before, this issue of the impact of cross-border taxation, mobility, workers' mobility, how do we fix that? Because you were talking about these potentially the personal income tax can become not as progressive as it used to be because of this issue of mobility workers and non-mobility workers. How do we make sure that it contributes to a fair system where everyone has access to social protection and everyone actually pays their fair share?
You're still asking me, Beatrice. And if you're still asking me, my opinion is that we need to tackle it before there is a race to the bottom of the scale that we saw on capital with capital mobility. So we saw a very quick increase in mobility of capital over the last 40 years, and as it happened, we saw progressively increased competition and a race to the bottom. My preferred solution in terms of personal income taxes is to prevent that kind of path being taken on personal income taxes and start measures for coordination now to prevent a certain path dependency that we witness on corporate taxation.
So coordination is here, Kia, as Lydia was saying. Following up on the issue of need for funds to make sure that we reskill and upskill workers, of course, taxation is going to be key in this, but also it can be EU funds. So moving forward, how do you see plans such as the Resilient and Recovery Facility contributing to that change? Because we see that digitalisation is one of the key objectives, also the green transition. This has an impact on the labour market, on the workers' needs. So do you think that there can be a combination of money coming straight away from governments, raise on taxation, but also the EU contributing to those changes?
Absolutely, but I'm very much in favor of a balance. There is a bit of criticism when we look at Recovery and Resilience funds. If if we only see it from the perspective of generating common debt, which is good in the sense that it's European common debt, but then we are not seeing the other side of the coin, which is adding up debt to future generations. So there has to be a balance in the sense that we have to mobilize private capital, so private investments, to harness the potential of the twins, right? The green transition and digitalization. But here, and speaking about, because this is, in the end, this is something to which everyone is convoked. So each and every one individual of our societies, we have to play our role in this transition, and therefore businesses are a big part of it. And that's the reason why I think it is important, and I was listening to Rita, there's sometimes a bit of skepticism or prejudice when we talk about tax incentives or tax exemptions. And here, when we talk about taxation, eventually we have to come up with in a model having all these challenges that we are talking here today, but as well on how we will apply the RRF, which should be balanced because we have to invest in the public sector, but also the private sector. We need to go to undertake several reforms to have the countries fit for the future, or member states fit for the future. But here, and talking specifically about businesses, I think there's also room for discussing and trying to prevent the race to the bottom as well on personal income. But I want just to underline the importance of businesses in the role of the macro, of the big picture when we talk about both the RRF and taxation. If we have a good combination, not forgetting that we are witnessing a peak on the inflation, which will have an impact on the purchase power of households and so on. And I think taxation can here play a role, in particular for on personal income taxation for working class, because as Rita was saying, it seems like we are shrinking, or the two either the bottom and the top are going to be impacted severely by the several challenges. I think here it is very, very relevant that we do not neglect the potential for tax incentives, tax exemptions when are justified and when they make sense. But I think in the end of the day, it's all about a moderate balance that we will have to foster within our societies, both with public sector and private sector.
That, again, calling for collaboration, in this case, between the private and the public sector to make sure that we all achieve the goals. I wanted to get back into the conversation, Elias. Another issue that you look into in your report is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is in a way a consequence of globalization. And I was wondering what this pandemic in particular had as a result in the labor market, and how did you see also these economic consequences of the pandemic impacting taxation eventually?
So no doubt COVID has impacted the way we work and the way we understand work. I would even talk about the creation of a new transition together with digital and greening. I think I would highlight three trends that have been intensified during the COVID years and all have implications for tax revenues. The first is the increase of platform work, where location does not really play an importance and anybody could employ workers or could work from anywhere for anyone. The second is the intensification of precarious type of employment, or atypical, if you don't like the term, which has various extensions, including the physical and mental health of such employees. And the third is the great resignation movement, where people realize suddenly that working may not be the highest priority. And all of these trends, or one way or the other, do have an impact on tax revenues. Now, when it comes into visible impacts, what we have seen is that young people have been impacted the most. In particular, we have seen that their labor market participation rates have dropped, and also their employability has gone down. So if we put this together with the phenomenon of aging of population that we talked about before, and of course the fact that young people are a source of future tax revenues, I think it is very important to take measures now, so in the future we're not talking about a lost generation.
One of the issues that we have been discussing before, and that I think fits a lot into this that you were explaining before, is that the way in which the labor market has changed also has an impact in labor rights. And now, when it comes to digitalization, especially when we talk about young people, one of the biggest issues that EU governments are trying to tackle is platform workers and how that fits into the labor market, a question of labor rights, and also that has an impact on taxation, because the way those jobs are taxed are different, because there are no contracts. Most of the time they're self-employed. So I was wondering if this is something that you have looked into, and if you feel that it can also be a hassle for the tax systems, considering all the different challenges in terms of salaries, in terms of social protections.
So it's not something that we have been investigating, but what we know is that the share of platform work has been increasing, and since it is a new phenomenon and it is up to the member states and the tax system of each country to adjust, there is a great challenge that is being posed here. And what happens usually is that there is a little bit of a lag until this adjustment is being made. So I think we're currently into this transition where countries are trying actually to figure out how to deal with this phenomenon and of course benefit from it. Because if we think about it, some years ago that technology would not allow, and all these platforms were not there. The systems were used in a different way, but we have seen in many cases, and Greece is one of these cases, that they have managed to adjust, and they're actually benefiting from the opportunities that we have because of the technology. But to give you an answer to your question is not something that we have been investigating in detail.
Thank you so much, Ilias. We have a question coming from the audience, and I know this is something that Rita was very much looking forward to discuss. And the question is digitalization helping to fight tax fraud and tax evasion, or is it rather that it has become easier to engage in tax evasion due to the increase in digitalization? And I know this because one of the issues that we wanted to discuss today is how digitalization is also part of how we collect taxes. So Rita, would you like to jump on this one?
Yes, sure. So the answer to the question is both. So digitalization has facilitated, to some extent, tax evasion, particularly we saw with consumption taxes, because it's much easier to purchase across borders, to do it online. The traders that you're often buying from, the suppliers that you're buying from, are established in different countries, which makes it much harder to control if they are paying taxes or charging taxes or not. So we have seen challenges that are coming directly from the digitalization into an increased potential for tax evasion. However, we also see the other way around. So what we have seen is how we can instrumentalize, so we can use new technologies in order to combat fraud, and it has been a lot of innovation in this area across the world. So we have been modernizing our tax administrations throughout the world in a kind of in a way that is almost below the radar, that most people don't notice, and the public is broadly unaware of this phenomenon. But tax administrations have been using these new technologies to combat tax fraud and tax evasion in a very intense way. Now, obviously, the most outward facing that taxpayers may notice is being able to do their tax returns online, but behind behind closed doors, there is much more going on. Now, what I see as a kind of big challenges ahead is that even though these technologies tend to be very effective, they also bring challenges in their use themselves. So, for example, one of the most used technologies that has been proved to be very effective against tax evasion is the real-time technology, which basically tracks all transactions happening in real time across the country. So is a massive data gathering exercise. Now, this has been really effective in combating, in the countries that has been implemented, in combating tax evasion, in underreported sales, for VAT purposes, for corporate income tax purposes, for personal income tax purposes even. But it means that there is a massive amount amount of data that can be misutilized by either governments themselves or by hackers, for example. So there is a big kind of a source of information on every citizen that can be used for ends that are beyond combating tax evasion. The second big challenge that these systems create is the challenges of biases. Now, we have seen the recent example of AI biases used by tax administrations in the Netherlands, in which there was a big scandal where the government had to resign as a result of embedded discrimination in the AI system in the Netherlands, which targeted unfairly members of minority populations in the Netherlands. And this is the type of stuff that is a risk going forward. The more we rely on these systems, they are great, effective tools for combating evasion, but the more safeguards we have to have in order to prevent them from A, being misused by governments and by hackers, and B, having embedded discrimination and biases in the way they function. Now, one comment, one example that I used previously with Beatrice to illustrate the risks is, for example, Russia has one of the most sophisticated AI systems for tax administrations in the world. They claim, and probably rightly so, that is extremely effective on combating evasion and fraud. But of course, it raises big concerns about how that data is being used. So these are the types of challenges that we face as we go forward on the using more and more technology in order to make our tax systems more effective.
Very interesting indeed that digitalization can contribute to fight tax evasion, but it highlights a lot of issues related to data protection as well. Thank you so much for that contribution, Rita, because I think it's something that really illustrates the challenges that we have ahead. Now, Lydia, I would like to turn to you, because another challenge in terms of the digitalization is that when it comes to taxing incomes, and we have seen it with personal income tax with mobility workers, but it's the same with companies. And you were mentioning before the agreement within the OECD, which has been instrumental to try to address these issues when it comes to the big techs. We have that agreement, as you said, blocked at the council, but do you see moving forward that in order to tackle those challenges, that companies can be placed anywhere in the world while they are doing business globally, is actually the international cooperation, and that the EU has to play an important role here?
No, absolutely. What I'm a little bit afraid is that the EU is somehow trying to set the standards, and in the end of the day, we might fail because there's a blockage in the council, and then it somehow discourages other partners in the world to be on board of the solution that we already discussed. In a more globalized world, it makes no sense that we take more individualistic approaches. But we don't see any special appetite on the US side to actually move forward with the implementation with the Pillar 2. Here in Europe, we have the blockage in the Council, but we still don't have sufficient information on how it will be actually implemented through Pillar 1, in particular the proposal of the Commission. So we are still a bit unclear on what are the next steps. I think the first step should be to have a deal in the Council, and then, but it doesn't mean that we cannot move forward in trying to understand what is going to be the actual impact of the implementation of the deal. So I do believe that the future has to rely on more international cooperation. Inside in Europe, we also have to do more in terms of exploring the full extent of the treaties in terms of taxation, because we were talking at the very beginning that indeed the European Parliament has limited competences, but in the framework of the treaties, we still have some flexibility at the institutional level to explore further cooperation, in particular in the exchange of information and administrative cooperation. So we still have a bit some homework to do, and then of course making sure that the partners globally are have the same vision, because if we look at other pressing challenges that we have, as for example climate change, Europe has been leading the fight against climate change, but we cannot do it alone. And the truth is that the European continent is the least contributor for CO2 emissions when compared to the other big players in the world. So here we also have our responsibility to drive change globally, but first we also have to do some housekeeping and making sure that we have our homework done. But I do believe that the future is more and more global, is more integrated. There's other challenges that might arise with some distortions in the single market, in the digital single market. So we really have to look on these dimensions and make sure that we address them to make sure that we don't have situations as reported by Rita of a race to the bottom. So this is, I think it is relevant. And one last note, still referred to the combat of tax evasion, tax fraud, and so on, and new technologies. I have been dealing with this topic very closely, and this week the Parliament will vote the report on new technologies on taxation. And it is fundamental, very, very important that we safeguard, that we make sure that individual rights are protected in terms of compliance with the GDPR. So it is very important, and it's also important to assure that we have competent and sufficient supervisory authorities that can monitor the use of the new technologies as well.
That is absolutely key. And I wanted to have a short follow-up, because you were talking about we have to first or organize our house before we move into pushing other countries to do the same. And we see that there are differences among different countries when it comes to taxation, particularly when it comes to corporate income tax. So how do you see this discussion that with Luxembourg, with the Netherlands, with countries where there is a competition in terms of tax systems, moving forward and trying to be a leading force in the international sphere, and coming from the European Parliament yourself? So how do you see this interaction between different member states? How do you see the issue of unanimity when it comes to tax decisions, and how that can have an impact to all these changes that we need to be taken care of?
Yeah, well, I'm in favor of tax competition. As I said, as long as it's fair, loyal, and transparent. There is tax competition in the US as well. What we have to make sure is that, we've over the last 40 years, 30 years, there has been trends of capital mobility due to the tax regimes. There are some risks of those tax regimes being sufficiently aggressive and might bring some distortions. I'm not specifying any particular case, but there's been and also because certain countries are associated to not very good practices. But in any case, I think it is relevant to acknowledge that each member state has its own social security system, for example. Each member state treats intellectual property rights in a different way. But maybe there's some sources or some potential to fine-tune and to coordinate. I think the best word here is coordination, to make sure...
And harmonization.
And we have to balance between harmonization and coordination. I think it's a two-way approach. But we cannot neglect these realities that impact severely the state budget, right? So it is important to have this in mind when we have the discussion on unanimity or not in the Council. So it's a controversial discussion. I still don't have the recipe to resolve it, but I do believe that we still have some room and some margin for maneuver within the framework of our treaties to foster better cooperation and better exchange of information among member states on the field of taxation.
We'll be following that work at the European Parliament. We have a few minutes left, and I want to ask one last question to each speaker and to try to have a last remark. So I'm going to turn myself first to Lies, and I would like to know what is for you the most important megatrend that you're seeing affecting the labour market and therefore taxation, and how do you think the European Union should tackle it?
That's a good question. I think well, I said before, there is aging, there is COVID, there is upskilling, and all of this that could affect tax revenues and challenge the net position of governments, which is broadly defined as the revenues from households minus expenditure to households. So the question is, I think, how strong will the impact of all these megatrends be? So in trying to answer this question, together with colleagues from the Joint Research Center, we undertook a quantitative study utilizing our CEDEFOP skills forecast with our macro simulation model Euromod. And what we found is that while in 2019, almost all EU member states had a negative net position, this position is forecast to be substantially lower by 2030, and this trend is significant for Eastern European countries. And of course, this is assuming that there is no change in policies. So I think the key question here is what measures can be taken so we don't end up realizing this finding of our study.
Thank you so much, Elias. Now, Rita, I'd like to turn to more of the issue of taxation. We have been discussing how those trends are calling for a change. How do we have to reshape our tax mix to make sure that it's fit for the challenges that we have ahead? This for Rita, please. This question was for Rita. I don't know if she's still there.
I was just about to say that I'm not an expert in taxation, and I will pass the floor.
You were surprised, right? Yeah, I was not going to do that to you. So please, Rita, go ahead.
Yes, so I think the trends that we're witnessing are going to affect the tax mix. I think the biggest risk is, as I mentioned, is with the automation and labor mobility, because rich countries and I count this in broad sense, EU member states fit into this category. Are really very much dependent on personal income taxes. So any shape up of digitalization on this area will have a big impact. I think that we have to accept the role of consumption taxes as well. Consumption taxes are a massive source of revenue around the world. In developing countries, it tends to be bigger than in EU member states, but it is a very significant part of EU budgets. About 20% of EU revenues come from just VAT. And I think that we need to have a conversation about consumption taxes. Of course, consumption taxes are often perceived as regressive, but they are very reliable in terms of lower levels of mobility of consumers. So they are more reliable as a source of revenue going forward. So I think we should have a conversation is if there is a shape up on personal income taxes, and we have to rely more and more on non-mobile elements of the economy, such as consumers, and therefore consumption taxes. How do we address this regressivity? How we move forward in order to make a progressive tax system in light of these challenges on income taxes and potentially increased reliance on consumption taxes. I think those are some of the challenges that we will face in the coming years. At this moment in time, if you permit me to expand a little bit on the question you asked, Beatrice, I think the biggest message in terms of the tax mix that I would like to pass is that for the last few years we have had so many resources poured into corporate income tax discussions. Of course, corporate income tax are very important for the tax mix, but going forward, what I would like to see more and more is discussion on other elements of the tax system, personal income taxes, consumption taxes, both general consumption taxes like VAT and regulatory taxes like sugar, tobacco, alcohol, etc., and elements of the tax administration. So what I would like to see in the coming years at the European level is a kind of a broader discussion on how our tax system should look like, that encompasses all tax instruments and all aspects of policy and administration. Thank you.
We are starting that conversation today, I'm sure. Lydia, what is it that you're expecting from the European Commission in terms of reshaping that tax system to make it to make it fit for purpose?
Yeah, I think it's today in the annual report on taxation from the European Commission, it states that the tax systems or tax regimes should be or should foster stability and simplicity, but also clarity if I may add. And I think that's the main goal that we need to try to envisage and to achieve at the EU level with the 27 different member states with the 27 different tax regimes. So I think here the role of the Commission is more and more relevant and more important, in the sense coordination is very much needed. Having in mind that we are in a much more integrated, globalized economy, knowing that the challenges are tremendous and various, but we cannot forget that we need to remain competitive. And we need to keep being in the front line of innovation. And we know taxation plays a big role in fostering innovation. And in my, just to conclude, what I see is that the future is Europe and the future is innovation, and therefore tax regimes and taxation has to be adapted to that future.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much, Lydia, Rita, and Elias, for your conversation. And thank you to you for contributing to this talk. Now, we close this panel, but stay with us because we have a closing remark from the Director General for Taxation and Customs Union at the European Commission, Gerassimos Thomas.
Good afternoon, it is time to make the closing remarks. I think the last remark by Lydia, who talked about the stability and simplicity of the tax system, are very important messages coming also out of our report. It's also coming out from a survey that was published early this month, who shows that tax rates are less important than predictability and transparency of the tax system in defining foreign direct investment. I also like Rita's last comment on the need to discuss the other elements of the tax mix. We spend a lot of time in discussing the new corporate tax reform, and we need to finish this job. But the message also coming out of the ART report is that we need to think about the future tax mix over the next 20 or 30 years and work backwards. I was particularly pleased to hear from Ruud from the IMF that there is a strong role for the EU in the design of the tax systems. Coming from the IMF, I think it's a good stimulus for us. And I think we looked and we heard today the type of challenges that we have in designing the tax system. Maria mentioned about the sustainable workforce and the challenges in designing a system that has ensures a sustainable workforce. This was reinforced by Elias on the importance of lifelong learning and the pros and cons and the challenges that it has for the tax system and the necessity for everybody to contribute from young to old. And Agnieszka mentioned the need for a sustainable benefit mix which adapts to the welfare system of its society. And last but not least, both Ruud and Rita referred to the dilemma about progressive or non-progressive tax system and the reliability that it has for sustainability of revenues. These are important issues that were brought up from the discussion, and I think it enrich our debate. Let's now spend a few minutes to take out the messages that come from our annual report on taxation and the tax trends, and then I will go back, let's say, to the issue of the tax mix. We all know that we are in a moment of significant stress to our public finances. We had a sharp downturn in 2020, and the future, the uncertainty of the outlook due to the war by Russia on Ukraine does not put us in a comfortable position. The deficit jumped from 0.5% of GDP to 7% of GDP. The aggregate debt ratio jumped very close to 100%, and they will remain with current forecasts above 100% in a number of member states even after 2023. And higher energy prices and the impact that they have on our economies make the fiscal consolidation even more difficult in the short term. We also witnessed for the first time since the financial crisis a reduction of nominal tax revenue, first time in a decade last year, and we need to face the megatrends that were discussed today against this background. Now, looking at the EU tax mix, first of all, what I would like to contribute to this discussion is that it is important to look at the various levels of government. This is very heterogeneous across member states, and it is important to look at all the taxes and not only at the national tax regimes. In some member states, taxes are primarily raised at central level, but in countries like Sweden, they collect 30% of their taxes at regional level. In Belgium and Germany, they have a lot of regional taxes and social security contribution. In Belgium, for instance, 25% of taxes are raised at central government level, 27% at regional, 5% at local level, 41% via social security contribution. So when we think about the tax mix for the future, we have to factor in all levels of government. And we need to carefully to analyze the tax base, particularly as we are transforming the system. Then there is the composition of the type of taxation. Germany has, with 60% labor taxation, has the highest reliances on labor taxes compared to consumption. This is closely followed by Sweden and Austria, close to 60% themselves, while Croatia and Bulgaria, they have labor taxation that is substantially lower. And there is a common element in Europe overall that capital taxation plays a small part in the tax mix compared to labor and consumption taxation. This was confirmed also by the calls of the previous speakers to focus more on wealth taxation, on capital taxation in the future. So we are, the tax rate of the stock of capital as a percentage to GDP has remained stable to around 2.5% in the last 10 years. And there might be a scope for looking into that and increasing this percentage. I would also say that in view of the aging population, it is questionable whether the strong reliance on labor taxation that we have in Europe is future-proof. And this, we see it also in the EU-wide labor tax wedge, which is still 40% of labor costs, despite the gradual decline that we had over the last 15 years or so. So I think we need to analyze carefully these aspects. I mean, the annual report on taxation and the trends report provide good input to this discussion, and I welcome the call by all the speakers to engage in a future-proof tax mix, on a debate on the tax mix, and that's what we are planning to do. As Commissioner Gentiloni mentioned, that we will engage in this debate over the next years. We have planned a tax symposium later in November that we invite all of you to participate, and we have a series of events on this to build up the knowledge and build up the debate. Some people mentioned the importance of green taxes. It's an important component of our Fit for 55 and Green Deal package. Still, as we speak, 77% of the green taxation, environmental taxation, is around energy taxes. And this is an area that I think we will have a major expansion in the future, particularly if we try to reduce labor taxation. I think we need to design it carefully. I think the so-called behavioral taxes might not be stable over time, each one of them, but this is a component of behavioral taxes of the overall tax mix. They provide a stable input over the years. So I want to thank you today for participating in this rich debate. I want to thank our speakers, the colleagues who organized the conference, the moderator here, all the colleagues in the studios. I think it was a rich debate, and let's try to be careful in designing the framework of a tax mix by 2050 with all the challenges that we recognize today, and walk backwards and have the right initiatives at the right time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Director General, and thank you to you for following us today during these past 3 hours where we have been talking about the mega trends that are affecting taxation and the way in which the EU can actually tackle them. To continue this conversation, make sure that you check out the annual report that was published today, but also that you follow us to the next events that are coming up in the next few months, in which these discussions is going to keep on going, and make sure that you stay tuned for the tax symposium that is happening on the 28th of November this year on the road to 2050, a tax mix for the future. Thank you so much again for staying with us today, and keep the conversation about taxation going.